They buried him as a disgraced king, lost under a parking lot for centuries. But when archaeologists unearthed the twisted skeleton of Richard III, it wasn't just bones they found. It was the start of a revelation that would shake England's history to its core. DNA testing promised to settle the story of who this infamous monarch really was. Instead, it exposed a scandal that cut right through the legitimacy of royal bloodlines. What did the science reveal about Richard III's reign, his reputation, and even the monarchy itself? Stick around, because this discovery might just rewrite history as we know it. The king under a car park. Today, he's remembered less for his reign and more for the way he was found, buried under a car park in Leicester, a disgraced king lost for centuries. Richard III, the last English king to die in battle, was dragged out of the shadows of history when archaeologists unearthed his twisted skeleton. But long before that shocking discovery, Richard's life had already carved a permanent scar across England's story. Richard was no ordinary monarch. He was the brother of Edward IV, the man who usurped his own 12-year-old nephew, Edward V, and seized the crown. His reign lasted barely 2 years before he was killed at the Battle of Bosworth, a bloody clash that ended not just his life, but also the Wars of the Roses, the infamous dynastic struggle that tore England apart. His death was more than a battlefield loss. It was the last breath of the House of York. To his enemies, Richard was a murderer. Rumors pinned him with the deaths of his nephews, Edward and Richard, the famous Princes in the Tower, as well as the killing of Henry VI. Shakespeare immortalized him as a hunchbacked tyrant, a scheming villain with blood on his hands. Yet modern historians argue the truth may be far more complicated. Some see him as a shrewd, effective ruler caught in a storm of propaganda. But the question remains, was Richard III really the monster history painted him to be? Or was he the victim of one of the greatest smear campaigns in royal history? Richard was born on October 2, 1452, in Northamptonshire, the youngest surviving son of Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. No one expected much from him. He wasn't destined for greatness, nor was he supposed to sit on the throne. His early years were spent at Fotheringhay Castle, where his childhood was shaped by his cousin, the Earl of Warwick, later infamous as the Kingmaker. Warwick trained him in the ways of a knight, sharpening his skills for the brutal conflicts to come. Richard's life changed forever in 1460, when his father and elder brother Edmund were killed at the Battle of Wakefield. He and his surviving brother George were forced into exile, watching the Wars of the Roses tear England apart. But fortune shifted. After the Yorkist victory at the Battle of Towton, Richard returned home, and his eldest brother, Edward, seized the throne as Edward IV. Richard, barely 9 years old, watched as his brother was crowned king in June 1461. In that moment, Richard's own fate was sealed. He was given the title Duke of Gloucester and pulled directly into the heart of England's brutal power struggle. With Edward on the throne, the Kingmaker Warwick set about arranging advantageous marriages for his daughters. But cracks soon appeared. Warwick and Edward clashed, and Richard's other brother, George, sided with his father-in-law against the king. The family fractures deepened when Warwick aligned himself with Margaret of Anjou, queen of the rival Lancastrians. Richard and Edward fled into exile in 1470, finding safety with their sister Margaret in Burgundy. But within a year, Edward struck back. In a stunning campaign, he reclaimed his crown through victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury. And this time, Richard was not just a spectator. At just 18 years old, Richard proved his worth. Though smaller in build than his brothers, his training as a knight made him a formidable fighter. He fought fiercely in both battles, helping crush the Lancastrian forces and witnessing the downfall of Warwick, the Kingmaker himself. Edward was restored to power, and Richard's loyalty and skill were noticed by all. With peace restored for the moment, Richard secured his future by marrying Anne Neville, Warwick's youngest daughter. Anne had already been widowed after her first husband, a Lancastrian prince, was killed at Barnet. By marrying her, Richard gained vast lands and wealth, becoming one of the most powerful landowners in England. But this wasn't just about money. Richard stepped into his role as a leader with unexpected success. He was entrusted with control of the north, where he built a reputation as a capable, fair, and strategic administrator. His Scottish campaign in 1482 further boosted his standing, proving he wasn't just a warrior, but also a shrewd commander. While Richard's star was rising, Edward IV's was dimming. The king's court became notorious for corruption and decadence, his many mistresses fueling his poor reputation. Edward even had George, Duke of Clarence, his own brother, charged with treason and executed in 1478. Richard tried to keep distance from the scandals, but he remained wary of one figure: Elizabeth Woodville, Edward's queen. Richard suspected Elizabeth and her family of manipulating the king's decisions, even whispering that she played a role in George's death of a king, and the rise of a protector. Then came the turning point. On April 14, 1483, Edward IV died suddenly, leaving behind 2 young sons and 5 daughters. The eldest boy, only 12 years old, was declared Edward V, but at his age, a protector was needed. That role fell to Richard. What should have been a smooth succession quickly spiraled into a deadly power struggle. Elizabeth Woodville and her family, the Woodvilles, were determined to hold power through a regency council. Richard, however, saw their influence as dangerous and unacceptable. For him, it was a threat not just to his nephew's reign, but to the entire Yorkist dynasty. Richard acted swiftly. On the road to Edward's coronation, he intercepted the royal party. Edward's uncle, Earl Rivers, and his half-brother were arrested and later executed. The boy king himself was taken under Richard's protection and escorted to the Tower of London. Officially, it was to await his coronation, but in reality, it was the beginning of the end. Parliament soon declared Edward IV's children illegitimate, stripping the 12-year-old king of his crown. Richard was announced as the rightful heir, and in July 1483, he became King Richard III. But Edward and his younger brother were never seen again. The 2 boys vanished within the walls of the tower, their fate one of history's darkest mysteries. Were they quietly murdered? Did Richard order it himself? Or was someone else behind the crime? The whispers never stopped. To many, Richard had crossed the line from loyal uncle to ruthless usurper, a king made by scandal. Richard III's rise to power was steeped in suspicion and scandal. He had seized the crown from a child, imprisoned the rightful heirs, and ruled with a shadow hanging over him. His reputation was cemented less by what he did as king, and more by how he got there. Richard was crowned king on the 6th of July, 1483, with his wife, Anne, at his side. The joys of the coronation, however, masked a shadowed throne. His reign, already stained with the whispers of murdered princes, quickly spiraled into tragedy. Barely a year later, his only son and heir, young Edward, died suddenly in July 1484. Richard was left heirless, a king with no future bloodline to carry his name. For a monarch, that was more than heartbreak. It was a political disaster. Queen Anne, crushed by grief, would not live long after. At just 28, she died at the Palace of Westminster. With her gone and no son to succeed her, Richard's hold on the throne grew weaker. In desperation, he named his nephew, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, as his heir. But this decision only fanned the flames of opposition. Across the realm, whispers began to rise. If Richard had no direct heir, perhaps it was time for another dynasty to take the crown. The Lancastrians seized their chance. Their chosen figurehead was Henry Tudor, a distant claimant who had spent much of his life in exile. With Yorkist bloodlines fractured and Richard's throne unstable, Henry's supporters saw a window to strike. Even closer to Richard, betrayal brewed. One of his own former allies, Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, turned against him. Only 2 months after Richard's coronation, Buckingham launched a revolt. Fortune smiled on Richard this time. The rebellion collapsed, and Buckingham was executed. But the cracks were already showing. 2 years later, the true threat emerged. Henry Tudor, alongside his uncle Jasper Tudor, landed in South Wales. This wasn't a small rebellion, it was an invasion. Backed by French soldiers, Henry marched across the countryside, his army swelling with new recruits who were tired of Yorkist bloodshed. Richard had no choice. The decisive confrontation would come on a battlefield. The Battle of Bosworth. On August 22, 1485, Richard's fate was sealed. At Bosworth Field, he faced Henry Tudor's army in a battle that would decide the future of England. Richard arrived on a white courser, a powerful warhorse that cut a striking figure on the field. His army outnumbered Henry's, around 8,000 men, to Henry's 5,000. On paper, Richard should have won, but battles aren't won by numbers alone. Early in the clash, Richard cried out, "Treason!" a desperate recognition that some of his allies had abandoned him. The powerful Stanley family, whose loyalty could have turned the tide, stood by and watched. Their leader, Thomas Stanley, was Henry Tudor's stepfather. And at the crucial moment, he sided with his stepson. Worse, Richard's trusted friend, John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, was killed, leaving the king's forces shaken. Still, Richard refused to surrender. In one last gamble, he launched a cavalry charge aimed straight at Henry Tudor. This was no ordinary attack. It was a direct strike at his rival's heart. Richard cut his way through the chaos, unhorsing Sir John Cheney, a jousting champion, and killing Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon. For a moment, he came within sword's reach of Henry himself. But the gamble failed. Surrounded by Henry's men, Richard was dragged from his horse. Accounts say his cries of defiance echoed as he fought to the last breath. A Welsh soldier is said to have struck the final blow with a halberd, smashing through his helmet into his skull. Later examination of his skeleton revealed the brutality of his end. 11 wounds, 8 of them to the head, delivered after his helmet was lost. A blade had hacked away part of his skull. Even his enemies admitted he fought like a lion. Henry VII's historian, Polydore Virgil, wrote that Richard died fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies. Another chronicler described the moment bluntly. Richard, the Boar of York, was slaughtered in the mud. Richard was the last English king to die in battle. His courage in death could not erase the scandal of his reign, but it sealed his legacy in blood. Richard's story did not end with his death. His corpse, stripped and humiliated, was tied to a horse and dragged back to Leicester. There, his naked body was displayed for all to see, proof that the usurper was gone. He was buried hastily in Greyfriars Church, without the dignity of a king. Rumors swirled for centuries. Some claimed his body had been thrown into the River Soar, others that his grave was lost forever during the dissolution of the monasteries. What is certain is that Richard's tomb vanished from memory. His dynasty, the proud House of York, was wiped away in that single battle. In his place, Henry Tudor rose as Henry VII, marrying Elizabeth of York, Richard's niece. Together, they united Lancaster and York, founding a new dynasty, the Tudors. Legends clung to Richard even in death. One story claimed that before Bosworth, a seer warned him that his head would be broken on the same spot where his spur struck on the ride into battle. As fate would have it, his spur struck the stone at Bow Bridge on his way out. When his corpse was carried back over the bridge, his head supposedly hit the same stone, splitting open. For centuries, Richard's final resting place was a mystery. Then, in 2012, archaeologists unearthed a skeleton beneath a Leicester car park. The bones bore the unmistakable wounds of Bosworth. DNA testing confirmed what no one thought possible. The lost king had been found. His rediscovery reignited the debate. Was he truly the ruthless villain Shakespeare painted? Or a misunderstood king crushed by propaganda? His twisted spine, his shattered skull, his lost grave, all of it seemed to echo the tragic, scandalous life he had led. Richard's death marked more than the fall of a man. It was the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, the end of the House of York, and the dawn of the Tudors. A new dynasty was born out of his defeat, one that would go on to shape the world with rulers like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. But Richard III remains one of the most haunting figures in English history, a man who rose from obscurity, fought for his family, seized the throne in scandal, and died as the last king on the battlefield. Was he a villain, a hero, or something in between? His story, soaked in blood and betrayal, continues to captivate us centuries later. From the throne of England to a grave under a car park, Richard's life and death are a reminder of just how thin the line is between power and ruin. Was King Richard III actually wicked? Richard III is one of history's great enigmas. To some, he was a brave king and a skilled ruler who cared about justice and punished corrupt nobles. To others, he was a crooked tyrant who clawed his way to power, poisoned his own wife, murdered his nephews, and deserved the twisted legacy that Shakespeare immortalized. But who was the real Richard? Was he truly wicked, or was his reputation a carefully crafted lie that outlived him? The challenge in uncovering Richard's true character is simple. Almost every account we have is biased. Chronicles like the Croyland Chronicle, the letters of Dominic Mancini, or later writings by Polydore Virgil, and Thomas More were written by men who either had an agenda or lived under Tudor rule, where speaking ill of Henry VII's enemy was a matter of survival. Even Richard's own letters show glimpses of his nature, but they are too few to settle the debate. Not all voices painted Richard as a villain. Historian John Rouse, writing while Richard was still alive, called him a good lord with a great heart, who punished oppressors of the common people. The Italian observer Dominic Mancini reported that Richard had a strong reputation and that both his private and public life won him respect, even from strangers. The city of York openly mourned his death after Bosworth, an astonishing act of defiance against Henry Tudor that suggests Richard had genuine loyalty in the north. Yet, Richard was not without enemies. As early as 1482, insults were being thrown at him in the north. By 1484, placards began appearing, mocking him with biting words. One of the most famous came from William Collingbourne, who nailed a lampoon on St. Paul's Cathedral, accusing Richard and his council of corrupt rule. The cat, the rat, and Lovell the dog all rule England under a hog. The hog was Richard himself, a reference to his white boar emblem. Even worse, rumors swirled that Richard had poisoned his wife, Queen Anne, and that he planned to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York. Richard was forced to call together lords and city officials to publicly deny these accusations, proof of just how damaging they had become. So much of Richard's reputation has been built not just on what he did, but on how he supposedly looked. Contemporary accounts agreed that Richard had one shoulder slightly higher than the other, a detail confirmed centuries later by the discovery of his scoliosis-ridden skeleton. But otherwise, he was described as comely, lean, and even graceful. A German visitor, Nicolas von Popolo, described him as tall and strong, with delicate limbs and a noble heart. Yet within a few decades of his death, stories grew wilder. John Rouse, the same man who once praised him, later under Henry VII's reign, reversed his view completely, painting Richard as a freak born with teeth and long hair, his body deformed and stunted. This grotesque image was less history and more character assassination. When Richard fell at Bosworth, Henry Tudor had every reason to blacken his enemy's name. The Tudors needed legitimacy, and what better way than to paint Richard as a usurper, murderer, and monster? Tudor writers like Polydore Virgil and Thomas More ran with this idea, describing Richard as devious, flattering, and treacherous. More branded him crook-backed and ill-featured, while Virgil emphasized his deformity as a reflection of inner evil. Shakespeare later turned these portrayals into theater, creating one of the greatest villains in English literature. a hunchbacked Machiavellian schemer who would stop at nothing for power. The line between fact and fiction blurred, and Richard's reputation was sealed. Yet even Tudor voices admitted something strange. Richard may have been ruthless, but he was also a capable ruler. William Camden noted that, albeit he lived wickedly, he made good laws. Francis Bacon, centuries later, echoed the same idea, that Richard was cruel, but also a reformer who created policies that helped ordinary people. Even during his reign, common folk benefited from his laws on bail, land disputes, and justice. To some, this suggests he was not the tyrant Shakespeare made him out to be, but rather a politician who was both feared and respected. From the 17th century onwards, a small but passionate group of defenders emerged. Sir George Buck argued that Tudor writers had slandered Richard with spiteful scandals. In the 18th century, Horace Walpole went further, publishing historic doubts on the life and reign of King Richard III, questioning whether Richard had really committed the murders attributed to him. Later defenders suggested it was Henry VII, not Richard, who had the most to gain from the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. Even into the 20th century, historians like Clements Markham argued that much of Richard's black legend was nothing more than Tudor myth-making. More recent historians take a middle ground. Charles Ross argued that Richard was simply a man of his times. The late 15th century was a brutal age where nobles schemed, betrayed, and killed to secure power. By those standards, Richard was no worse than his peers. Others, however, still insist that Richard was ruthless and likely responsible for the death of his nephews, the mystery of the princes in the Tower being the darkest shadow over his legacy. The Richard III Society, founded in 1924, continues to campaign for a reassessment of his reign, arguing that Shakespeare's villain was little more than propaganda. Richard III's story is the ultimate example of how history can be written by the victors. During his life, he was respected, even admired. After his death, he became a monster in the eyes of the Tudors, a cautionary tale, a villain who deserved his fate. The truth is likely more complicated. He may not have been the saint his defenders wish him to be, but nor was he the devil Shakespeare immortalized. So we're left with a haunting question. Was Richard III the last true Yorkist king, fighting bravely to the end for his crown, or a ruthless usurper who destroyed his own family to sit on the throne? History may never give us a clean answer, but one thing is certain. Richard III, whether hero or villain, remains one of the most controversial kings England has ever known. DNA just solved the mystery of King Richard III, and it's bad. They buried him like a criminal, shoved into the ground without honor, his grave forgotten under centuries of stone, soil, and concrete. For years, his name was dragged through history as England's most infamous villain, the king with a crooked back, the usurper, the murderer of his own nephews. But when archaeologists dug beneath a car park in Leicester, what they uncovered didn't just rewrite Richard III's story. It shook the foundations of England's royal bloodlines themselves. So, what did DNA testing really reveal about Richard III? And why is the truth more shocking than the lies? It all began in August 2012. The University of Leicester, Leicester City Council, and the Richard III Society came together to launch a project many thought was impossible: finding the lost remains of Richard III. The mission was led by Philippa Langley of the Looking for Richard project, with archaeologists from the University of Leicester handling the excavation. Their target was Greyfriars Church, a place that had been demolished during Henry VIII's brutal dissolution of monasteries. Historians believed Richard was buried there in 1485 after his bloody defeat at the Battle of Bosworth. But centuries later, that sacred ground was nothing more than a city center car park. Strangely enough, this wasn't just a wild guess. Back in 1975, Audrey Strange from the Richard III Society had already predicted that Richard's grave lay beneath one of those car parks, and in the 1980s, Historian David Baldwin argued the site was just a little further east, beneath Greyfriars Street. No one knew for sure. Then in September 2012, the archaeologists hit pay dirt. Within days of digging, they found the foundations of Greyfriars Church. And not long after, they discovered something far more chilling: a human skeleton buried beneath the choir of the church. At first glance, the skeleton fit the bill. It was a man, buried in the right spot, and the bones revealed severe scoliosis of the spine, giving him one shoulder higher than the other, just like historical accounts described. But the real horror was in the injuries. This man had not died peacefully. His skull showed multiple fatal blows, one from a sword that sliced through bone, and another from a halberd that left a jagged hole at the base of the skull. One cut was so deep it would have exposed the brain. A forensic pathologist concluded these were battlefield wounds, deliberate, brutal, and final. The body had 10 wounds in total: dagger strikes to the face, cuts to the jaw, slashes on the ribs, and even a humiliating stab through the pelvis. Historians believe Richard's naked body was slung across a horse after death, paraded as a trophy, and stabbed again to dishonor him. For the first time in centuries, the story of Richard's violent end wasn't just a legend. His bones proved it. Finding the body was only half the battle. To confirm it was really Richard III, scientists turned to DNA. Back in 2004, historian John Ashdown Hill had traced the living descendants of Richard's sister, Anne of York. One of them, Joy Ibsen, a Canadian woman, was found to be a direct 16th-generation descendant. After her death, her son, Michael Ibsen, provided a DNA sample. When the scientists compared his mitochondrial DNA, passed down through the maternal line, to the skeleton's DNA, the results matched. Suddenly, the odds were overwhelming. In February 2013, the University of Leicester confirmed it beyond reasonable doubt. The skeleton was Richard III, but DNA testing did more than identify the body. It opened a door to secrets no one expected. The team went further and sequenced Richard's entire genome. He became the first historical figure whose DNA was completely mapped. At first, everything seemed straightforward. The maternal line checked out exactly as predicted. But then came the scandal. On the paternal side, the line of kingship, something didn't add up. Richard's DNA showed no link to the supposed descendants of Edward III, England's great medieval king, and Richard's own great-great-grandfather. That gap could only mean one thing. Somewhere along the royal family tree, there had been an illegitimacy, a hidden affair, a broken bloodline. If true, that meant the sacred idea of a pure royal line, the very thing that legitimized kings and queens, was shattered. The crown that had passed through the Plantagenets, the Tudors, and eventually to today's Windsors could have been built on a lie. As if that wasn't enough, the scientists uncovered other bizarre details. Traces of roundworm eggs were found in the soil around his pelvis, suggesting Richard had been suffering from a parasitic infection during his life. Then came the face. Using 3D scans of his skull, forensic experts reconstructed Richard III's appearance. What they revealed wasn't the monstrous hunchback of Tudor propaganda, but a serious youthful man with sharp features and earnest eyes. He looked more like a tragic figure than a villain. After centuries in the ground, Richard's bones were finally given the dignity denied him at death. In 2015, he was reburied in Leicester Cathedral with full ceremony. A museum dedicated to his story now stands near the site where his grave was found. But the questions remain. Was he truly the ruthless tyrant Shakespeare painted? Or was he a victim of history's smear campaign, his legacy twisted by those who defeated him? And most importantly, what does that DNA scandal mean for the royal family's claim to power today? The discovery of Richard III's skeleton was more than archaeology. It was the unearthing of a national myth. His body told of a brutal death. His DNA whispered of broken bloodlines, and his face revealed a man far different from the villain England was taught to hate. In the end, the search for Richard III didn't just solve a mystery. It forced England to confront the darkest truth about monarchy, that even kings can be buried, forgotten, and exposed. So, what do you think? Was Richard III the monster history painted him as? Or was he a victim of lies written by his enemies? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.